Good morning. Thank you, Don. I'm a little bit overwhelmed by how emotional this morning has been. Watching the 50th reunion class parade in was very emotional, and congratulations to all of you, and thank you for coming today. I want to talk today about inclusivity, and I think that I'm just going to dive right in. Inclusivity has to include an awareness of lots of things: race, class, sexual orientation, identity, gender, language, place of birth, physical abilities, religion, among lots of other things. But for the purposes of my talk today, I want to focus on race primarily as a barrier. And that's partly for time constraints, but also because I really think that we have a history of how we initially treated enslaved Africans that has sort of impacted our whiteness throughout time. And so today I'm here as a white person who is a little frustrated with the status quo. I am sick and tired of a society that forces a very narrow definition of value on its citizens. When I was a student here at DePauw, I was embarrassed that I needed financial aid. And while it's true that there weren't very many poor people here, I think it is also true that I was guilty, continue to be guilty, of perpetuating a way of living that really excluded many, many people. Being born with white skin into a society that gives preferential treatment to white people not only gives us a lot of privilege, it also comes at a cost. We are expected to be complicit with this perpetuation. So I was really happy to hear about an art exhibit here at DePauw called Invisible Walls. And as I understood it, the purpose of this exhibit was to highlight the disconnect that students feel even when they live together and go to classes together. And I was really struck by the importance of this title, because I think we would all agree intellectually that these walls are useless, but they are there and they are real. And I'm really proud of these students for being brave enough to acknowledge these walls. They are refusing to be complicit in this system that tries arbitrarily to divide us. So the other day when I was at my home outside St. Louis, I was walking with a friend, and we were just talking and walking, and she just bent down in the middle of our walk and picked up a piece of trash. And I hadn't noticed it. It was a candy bar wrapper. But her act of picking it up made me look down, and there's litter everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere. It's in the bushes, it's in the trees, it's in the puddles. And it occurred to me as we were talking that it was such a beautiful metaphor. I really think that these biases that we all carry, our discrimination, our internal messaging, all of that is just kind of cluttering up our lives. And I am hopeful that we can all start to see all of that clutter out there. I believe white people have a responsibility to acknowledge this litter, to collect it, to discard it. And I'm really pleased to see that DePauw has in fact been taking steps to acknowledge and discard this litter. The problem is that the myth of the American dream wants me to not see the litter. The American dream wants my blinders firmly in place so that I only see my life. But what that means is that if I'm white and I live in a safe community and I have a good job or other access to reliable income, if I have health insurance, I don't have to worry about my children when they go to school, or I don't have to worry about being stopped by police officers because of the color of my skin, then I think the status quo is working for me. And at a minimum, I don't need to worry about anyone that it might not be working for. But if I'm poor, or if I am a person of color, that same status quo is killing me. That status quo means food deserts, no grocery stores. It means underperforming schools that have fewer resources but dole out more punishments. It means driving in fear of a court system that would put me in jail if I didn't have money to pay a simple traffic fine. But I think what's really important for me to remember is that none of this is an accident. This was intentional. This is how our country has created the race barrier that exists today. So I live in St. Louis, which is the 5th most segregated city in the country. So based on this fact alone, my life expectancy, 91 years. But my black neighbor, barely 60 years. If she and I smoke the same amounts of marijuana equally as often, she's 3.7 times more likely to be arrested than I am. She is 3 times more likely to die of a stroke, 3.5 times more likely to be stopped by the police, and 4 times more likely than I am to die of pregnancy complications. So that's kind of intense, I know. So now I get to, well, what are we supposed to do with this? We are aware that these injustices are out there, this inequality. What are we to make of it all? James Baldwin, a Black American writer and activist, wrote a book called The Fire Next Time in 1964, which I believe was the same year that the class of '67 was first coming to campus. He talks about white people's inability to engage in critical self-examination. And he believes that that inability is what is preventing us from not only solving our own personal crises, but our domestic crises, our international crises. So he believes we really have to start with the self anytime we are to undertake a discussion of race and racism. So I'm gonna start with myself. I used to think that discrimination was certainly a shame, but it really had nothing to do with me. It kind of was happening out there. I knew we had some whitewashed history, and I knew kind of intellectually there were systemic problems. I certainly knew that there was no such thing as a genetic trait for inferior. I still didn't really see it as being about me. I never understood that discrimination works by having some people here and other people there. There's just no other way around it. I also felt pretty strongly that racist was really just an adjective, and you either were or you weren't a racist. It was kind of a one or the other. So I either tell bigoted jokes or I don't. I either support Black Lives Matter or I don't. I either want to fly the Confederate flag or support a Muslim ban or build a wall to Mexico, or I don't. I was also raised, as I think many of us were, to believe that talking about race was itself maybe racist, and it was bad manners to acknowledge different skin colors. And so I was raised to be colorblind. But the problem is that doesn't mean that I never saw color. To the contrary, I was all too aware of how segregated my hometown was, Chicago. I was raised in a suburb that was lauded for its commitment to diversity and integration, but I attended an all-white grammar school. My parents had few interracial friendships, and I was surrounded by a lot of people who just looked a lot like me, lots of Irish American middle-class folks. So it was normal in my family and in my community to compartmentalize reading about a Black person dying. It was expected that we would hold our purses closer when we walked at night or sit in groups on the L. But really, that was all ridiculous, and it was an illusion of some sort of safety from a made-up danger. It only injured me. My emotional poverty, as James Baldwin calls it, was fierce. These manifestations of my internalized racial messaging hurt me. They limited my humanity, limited not just my understanding of other people, but my understanding of my own self. My 16-year-old is on Twitter, as I'm sure some of your children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews might be, and he told me about a tweet he saw that said, "Racism is not something we are born with. It is a learned belief and response." And the image accompanying that was a children's book, an actual children's book, and it was about a white family, and the dad in the family was a white man, and there was a cook, and the cook was a Black woman. She cooked for the family, and then there was a Black janitor in the family as well. As I nodded in dismayed empathy, as my son tells me this story, and I'm seeing the pain in his eyes of this realization, he says to me, "Mom, that's aimed at children. It's going to imprint on their brains, and once it's there, you can't get rid of it." What I have found over these last years of practicing Baldwin's self-examination is that racism really is, in fact, everywhere. It's a toxic smog that we breathe, an iron cloak that we wear. I now know that I am, in fact, a racist. And I say that not as self-deprecation, but as honest self-reflection. How can I possibly not be when my entire life has led me to believe that that is actually the right way to be? This recognition has carried with it an enormous burden of sadness and guilt, yes, but it has also afforded me a freedom I never would have expected. Today, when I drive through Chicago, I understand that my old ideas about social service and diversity are not enough to combat the way skin color continues to divide and separate us. Today, when I observe my children's interracial friendships, I am so happy for them, yet also regretful for experiences I never had. Today, when I read about the enormity of white people's complicity, When I read writers of color discussing their oppression, I feel outrage and pain and frustration. I feel a lot of disappointment for myself for all the ways that I have failed. But in addition to my pain, in addition to my frustration, I am encouraged by the fact that the DePauw that I attended, one that was almost 97% white, is not the same as the DePauw of today. Today, students of color make up almost 30% of the student body. I am encouraged by the support and leadership of Justin Christian from the class of 1995, whose generous donation will support improvements to the building for the Association of African American Students, as well as inclusivity and diversity programming. And so as DePauw has demanded change and inclusivity, we too must demand these changes from ourselves, from our peers, from all of our institutions. Our new shared approach must not only recognize the mistakes of the past, but must also work to intentionally break down these remaining invisible walls. When we acknowledge these walls, when we see them for what they are, for the traumas and the pain and the tragedies that they have caused, then it opens up the parts of ourselves that we have hidden for far too long. It opens up our innate desire for connection, for empathy and understanding. I feel strongly that these conversations are incredibly important, and I applaud DePauw for having this conversation on campus with its members, and I hope that all of us are doing the same. As for me, I certainly do not have all the answers. I must look to people of color, to white people from marginalized groups, and yes, even to privileged white people, people who have taken up this mantle of anti-discrimination, anti-racism work long before me. My friends and colleagues, writers and researchers and activists, not to ask them to solve my problems, and certainly not to assuage my guilt, but to hear their stories, to amplify their voices, and to learn from their wisdom. So I will close today by asking you to consider how you might currently feel about racism, other kinds of discrimination. Are you curious about these feelings? Do you have a desire to see what that curiosity might be trying to tell you? Do you wonder how much better we might be as individuals, as societies, if we could finally fix these injustices? How much better we could be physically, ethically, and fiscally? Certainly, I believe DePauw both nurtured this kind of curiosity. It inspired us. I encourage all of you, as graduates of this wonderful institution of higher learning, to use these skills, critical thinking, intellectual curiosity, to see what kinds of solutions we can come up with. And I hope that we can all work together towards the day when students around the country, not just here in Greencastle, but at every campus everywhere, will be inspired, supported, and encouraged, not because of their differences. I'm sorry, I just got that line wrong. Not in spite of their differences, but because of their differences. Thank you.